Welcome back to Soul Reaver 2. Raziel has finally met Janos Audron, and unfortunately the Sarafan warriors followed Raziel, and now Janos, in an attempt to save Raziel without knowledge that Raziel is indestructible, threw him, warped him into an antechamber, and now Raziel is trying to activate the Fire Forge here in order to get out and try and save Janos. Before discussing anything that happened in that exchange between Raziel and Janos, I will want to just get this elephant in the room out of the way and talk about this liquid. This is definitely not water, this is an unidentified liquid that looks very much like blood, which makes sense because requiring a vampire messiah to swim in water or in a water-based liquid would make no sense because vampires die to water. So, a few things. First of all, Janos Audron used a term that we heard for the very first time then, and it's also the last time when we hear it, and it's the binding. The binding is essentially the sorcery that is behind the pillars. If you remember, the Light Forge, or rather the murals in the Light Forge, they were showing how the pillars were holding something back. This sorcery of the pillars that allows for it is the binding. That's what it is. Essentially, it is a term that can be used interchangeably with the pillars itself, and that's probably part of the reason why we never ever hear about it again. So, next thing. The pillars are the lock, and the Reaver is the key. Well, the first time I played Soul Reaver 2, I thought it was a metaphor, and as a result, did not pay any attention to that. That was a mistake. That is not a metaphor, that is quite literal. The pillars are a very literal lock, and the Reaver is a very, very literal key. It's also connected to the schematics that, if you may remember, we saw in the subterranean ruins in that chamber that I pointed out in one of the first videos. And there's that. So this is something to keep in mind, but it's not really going to become relevant until the very end of Defiance. So right now I'm pretty much just explaining what Janos was talking about. Another thing is that Janos, while obviously aware of a messiah, isn't simply aware that there is a vampire messiah that will come and save Nosgoth. He's actually aware that this is specifically Raziel. And at first glance it doesn't make sense, but if you think about it, it does, but it only does make any sense in the context of future reveals that will once again come in the middle of Defiance. I refer to the middle of Defiance very often, but that's because this is when a lot of reveals are happening, so that has to be kept in mind all the time. Finally, the Reaver. Raziel sensed a palpable dread when the Reaver was presented to him, and there was a good reason. But that will not be divulged yet. And it also is connected to what Janos said about the Reaver, how it was forged by their weaponsmiths and enchanted to drain the enemies of their lifeblood. It's essentially a vampiric blade, which is why it's called the Reaver, but it is not yet the Soul Reaver. So that is another thing that has to be kept in mind, and luckily that is something that does not have to be kept in mind until the middle of Defiance. This is actually something that will become clear very shortly within Soul Reaver 2. And with this, I believe that I have covered everything there was to cover, and now I'll just say that I really hate this part of the Forge because you have to be very quick and very precise with the jumps and with the navigation of these updrafts. But thankfully we are almost done.
I plunged the Reaver into that furnace and forged the blade with elemental fire. With the Reaver thus imbued, I was now armed to unlock the elemental barrier and rescue Janos from his executioners.
This statue is really neat, and it kinda gives an insight on why does Janos know of Raziel and not of a generic messiah.
Look at his black heart, how it still beats.
The fiend intends to bury us alive. Raziel, we must get out of here.
Remember the sword! Forgive me. I'm sorry. I failed you.
No, Raziel. Perhaps this was my true purpose. Simply to save your life this once.
While I have taken yours.
Embrace your destiny, Raziel. You must reclaim the Reaver. It was forged for you and you alone. Without it, there is no hope.
As I backed away from Janos's body, I was overwhelmed by a sense of self-loathing so deep I could barely contain it. In that instant, I rejected all that I ever was, and embraced the role Janos had safeguarded for me so patiently throughout the centuries. I knew then what I had to do, the task for which I was uniquely prepared. I would pursue the Sarafan dogs to their loathsome fortress and avenge Janos Audrin's murder. Mobius would pay dearly for his treachery, and my Sarafan brethren would reap the horrors they had sown. I would retake the stolen Reaver, which was rightfully mine. And finally, when all these debts had been paid, I would reclaim Janos Audrin's heart from their filthy, unworthy hands. If the heart was truly imbued with the power to restore vampiric unlife, its highest purpose was clear to me. I would restore the heart to Janos, and thus undo the vile crime committed by my abominable former self.
And this is how the story of Soul Reaver 2 unfolds. And now we are entering into the very, very end game, and this is where people often begin to hate this game, because this is where the boss rush begins. But we will start it next time. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.